Okay, can you just stop sharing your screen for a second? So I just want to welcome everyone who is joining us today. This masterclass is all about really nailing your non-clinical interview skills by using a really, really valuable, I should say, structure, formula, process, answer intelligence. This is what it's all about. To help you really get to those answers in a way that feels great for you, but also for the receiver. In that case, whoever the hiring manager is, it can be useful for a load of other things like leadership conversations, negotiations, any kind of intelligent conversation that you have with anyone, from what I understand. But I'm a novice to this myself, and you are going to hear more from our guests, who are Tim and Brian, and I'm going to do a little interview. So the structure of this is I'm going to interview them for a few minutes just to find out a little bit more about why did Tim, who is one of our esteemed MF approved coaches, why did he recommend this as a really crucial webinar as part of the skills that we need to learn as doctors? Also how it works. I'm going to give a little bit of feedback from any insights, because I know a lot of people have filled in those questionnaires ahead of time. Thank you so much for doing that. And then we're going to do some live exercises from what I understand. Is that correct? Awesome. So we're looking at up to 90 minutes. If you do have any questions, unfortunately, the chat box does not seem to work for some reason. And unfortunately, I don't have the capacity to sort that out right now. But if you do have any questions, you can put that in the Q&A box or raise your hand, whichever works. So let's get going. And this is also recorded. So for those of you that you might have to step out for a bit, you can get a recording of this that will be available for 24 hours. So brilliant. Welcome, guys. So I'll start with Brian, who is new to this community, global community of doctors. Please tell me a bit more about Answer Intelligence.
Thank you for having me. Excited to be here with everyone today. So Answer Intelligence is the ability to provide elevated answers to important questions. So it's any important conversation. You can think of interviews. You're going to be on the interview. You have your skills as a physician, and I understand many of you are looking to take those skills and knowledge and apply them elsewhere. And there's some basic questions. What value do you provide to the organization? Why should the organization hire you? How do you work with others? And you need compelling answers to these questions. And the other thing I'll say from a physician standpoint, in my book, there's a section of co-authored chapters. And one of those chapters is Physician AQ. And we interview and talk with medical doctors. And I'm sure, hopefully everyone here can attest to this, but those that we interviewed and spoke with said, physicians are trained in question-based methodologies, not necessarily answer-based methodologies. And that's consistent with a whole wide range of professionals from sales, medical physicians, et cetera. We're used to questions. We're not as familiar with answers. And the last thing I'll say is it's very important to be well-skilled at answers, because answers provide influence. You provide compelling answers on your interview, what's going to happen? You're going to get the job. You're going to get multiple job offers. So that's a little introduction to AQ.
Thank you so much, Brian. I think this is going to be really exciting, because I'm looking forward to learning a little bit more about how I can improve my elevated answers to a lot of things. I can tell you that, like, for example, to my 6-month-old and my 2-year-old, as to when she asks why a lot. But Brian, sorry, but Tim, so obviously this is something that you have brought to our community. Why do you think it's particularly important for doctors from your perspective? I mean, you've worked with hundreds of doctors across the world who are changing careers. How is it practical from your insights?
I think what struck me when Brian and I had a conversation was that Answer Intelligence is a repository of skills that you can use to influence people in conversations. And what also struck me was that it's a very clear, very succinct, very integrated model of answering questions. But its utility is that you can keep using it for multiple functions. And I thought that for the first time, using it in coaching, I had a method, a model that was self-evidently clear and nuanced enough for people to grasp and to find ways in which they could themselves deploy it to good effect. I've been lucky. I've done a few hundred interviews as a panel member, and I understood some of the glitch points that doctors have. And I understand that when you're now moving into a different industry, you almost have to repurpose all you know about yourself in order to impress those who are on the other side of the table. And I think answer intelligence gives you something very, very vital, and that people using it before they go into interview context will elevate the responses and possibly provide a compelling basis for which employers will decide to employ them. So it didn't take me long to connect with Brian. It didn't take me long to sign up to the training, and I'm still mining lots and lots of nuggets from it, because it's a very, very powerful. And with some of the most powerful models, they're simple and clear. They're not simplistic. There's a difference. They're simple, because actually the more intelligent you are, the simpler you make what you're talking about. And that's something I think is a good virtue in answer intelligence.
Absolutely. But let's step back a bit and talk about some of the challenges doctors experience. So how do they know that they're not doing well when it comes to, or it's not ideal with the kind of answers that they come out with from what you've seen? So from what I can imagine, some doctors, say for example, they don't get the job that they've applied for, but they might not necessarily get the feedback that says your answers just weren't good enough.
Yeah.
In that way. I mean, what other symptoms are we talking about, medical history? What other symptoms do doctors come with you to say?
I think in my experience, one of the issues around interpersonal communicative effectiveness, how they've done conflict before, how they can, how will I say, extort their values, the principles by which they go forth, whether they can explain their clinical philosophies in terms of what they understand to be the role of a doctor in the context they're applying for. In my case, it was mainly psychiatry or senior jobs on board members. When you flip it, I also think it's pertinent to say, well, if I'm going into health tech or consulting, okay, I'm educated, I've got a medical degree, it means that I've got some degree of numeracy and literacy, but that doesn't mean I am ready for the role that I'm applying for. So how do I translate what I've done over 10, 15 years into something meaningful that the employer can grasp? Because it's almost a given that there are things I can bring that add value to my employer, but it's not a given that I can translate it in a way. And if you have 6 different ways of showing what you're doing or what you've done and what you can do, then there's a more powerful way than the traditional question answer where you go through your CV. And usually, having done many interviews, the time of day is important. Issues about impression management. So if you're not getting to grips with what the organization wants, if you can't tell them some of the ways in which you can add value, you're boring them. And you might do a very good job, but they're not looking for you, because actually you need to be above a particular threshold that they're looking for in any interview setting. So for me, doctors might assume that they're good at interview because they've done interviews to get into medical school. True. But the higher up the food chain you go, the more sophisticated your role you're looking for, the more sophisticated the answers require. And that's where answer intelligence comes into its own. It takes you beyond what might be the mean or the standard for. So I don't know, Brian has something to say.
I just want to amplify what you're saying. So I want to talk about like your number one soft skill, briefly. So each of us has our number one soft skill. Can you communicate that in 6 answer types? What is your number one soft skill as a concept and metaphor? Why is that skill important? Is this theory and story? How do you use that skill as a procedure in action? And we'll talk about what some of these answer types are going forward. That's difficult enough. So for example, if my number one soft skill is mentoring, I'll give you an example of a concise, powerful answer. What is, my number one soft skill? Mentoring. As a concept, I could define it. Mentoring is helping others become their better future selves at work. Mentoring consists of 3 dimensions: career support, social support, and role modeling. Then I can talk about it. That's concise. That's with command. Now imagine whatever your number one soft skill is: innovation, leadership, etc. Do you have command of the concept answer and all the answers? And Tim is right. As you move up, higher up, and for more senior executive positions, what do they expect? That your command and your ability to communicate is stronger. And now this is only exacerbated when you're trying to change careers and changing, outside of the medical profession. You have to transfer that knowledge to some other domain. So the challenges are twofold. So I think this is particularly germane, for the audience here.
Awesome. Thank you both. I think that's really given us great context as to why this webinar is important. And for those of you listening, if you've heard the last few minutes and that feels pertinent to you, you're definitely in the right place. So in the meantime, if you could, I've hopefully fixed the chat issue because people weren't allowed to, able to use chat. So please give it a go. If you've got any comments to say, please tell us where you're from and why you've joined today. If you have any direct questions, please put them in the Q&A box and we'll address them as we go. So I'm going to hand over to Brian and Tim, who are going to do a presentation about AQ to give us even further context, and then we'll do some exercises.
Tim, would you like to, kick things off with some intro remarks, and then I'll sort of paste.
So thank you, Brian. I really appreciate your support, because actually Brian is the person who designed, created this model, and it's a privilege to have him on the webinar masterclass day. Some of you might have had the privilege of hearing him on TED Talk and read his book. But essentially, I think I grasped the importance of this model, and I wanted to share like a new faith quickly. And one of the areas I thought it might provide best values in MedicFootprints. So I'm happy to be here, happy to be working with Brian. I'm hoping that this won't be the end of our journey together. It's the start of a journey of mining this model to best effect. It just so happens we're talking about interviews today. I think in terms of coaching, in terms of communication efficacy, in terms of negotiation, in terms of leadership, all manner of positive value-added activities, this model is very helpful. And I'm sure by the time you finish, you will see the utility of what I'm trying to proselytize. So Brian, over to you.
Thank you, Tim. And thank you again for everyone joining. I'm going to sort of pace our discussion and set Tim up as our subject matter expert. So that's how we'll be going through this. In terms of the approach for today, we have some content we're going to go through, and then we have some breakout exercises a little bit later in this slide deck. So let's try to get to that as soon as possible. So Tim's already introduced himself. He's a certified partner with AQ. And this is me, and the book, Answer Intelligence, AQ, is the ability to provide elevated answers to important questions. And what does AQ do? It allows you to emotionally connect with stories and metaphors, explain and predict with theories and concepts, and achieve results with procedures and action. So that's the colors on the wheel. So I'm going to start with a discussion of interviews, and then I'll punctuate this with something that might relate to you in particular. So, AQs for important conversations, and you can think of these conversations in terms of different degrees of elevation. And Tim alluded to sort of the difficulty and challenges you're looking to find, senior positions outside of the medical profession. But if we imagine this in terms of interviews, we have Mount Fuji. So 12,000 feet, it's a formidable mountain, but any able-bodied person can climb that. So in interview terms, it's equivalent to providing answers that get you a job. I think we can all do that, right? We can all get a job. Then we move up to Denali. Denali is the highest point of elevation in the US at 20,000 feet. And imagine it this way. You're interviewing, and when you have Denali level answers, they're compelling such that you're the #1 candidate for the job, right? That's an accomplishment. That's great. Then we move up to Everest. That's the highest point of elevation in the world, 29,000 feet. And when you have elevated answers at this elevation, your answers are so compelling, they invent a job for you, right? And if we take a step back and you think about the quality of the answers you want to provide in interviews, you want to approach Everest level answers. When you do that, you have multiple offers, you have offers for more money, you're very compelling. And that's what AQ is about, thinking about all 6 answers, how to frame them, and doing so in a very natural way during a live conversation. And just to punctuate this, I worked with a PhD, not an MD, but he was a PhD in the safety aviation space, a chief safety officer for the Swiss government for aviation. And he wanted to transition from that role to a new role being a consultant. And that's right on point with what you're doing. And initially, when he framed his concept for the value he provided, to the world, it was safety. And using AQ and thinking about and refining his concept, he realized it wasn't safety he was trying to provide, it was resilience. So this is a subtle difference, but when you think about the different answers you can provide in the world, what is your number one, skill? His was safety, transformed it to resilience. You want to think about each of these answers. What are, the compelling responses that are going to allow you to get that job? So it's about the slight transitions and tweaking as you go from a medical framing to a non-medical framing, the concept of safety, the concept of resilience. And it's very subtle, but I think the differences can be profound in terms of the impact. So that's the setup there. What is your number one soft skill? Safety versus resilience. Let me pause there for a second and see if Tim has something to add to this, and then we're going to sort of continue on with some subsequent slides. Also, if you have any questions about the model or framework, feel free to go through it. Maybe I should just briefly illustrate, what the model is. So, what is your number one soft skill? Resilience as a concept could be defined. You give a metaphor for resilience. I can talk about a story where I, was resilient and it was effective for the organization. Theory is cause and effect. So resilience leads to job performance. It leads to, sustainability of an organization. You want to be able to frame that in terms of cause and effect theory. And then procedures and action. So procedures are steps. So if I'm advocating resilience, how does that manifest itself in terms of the procedures by which I lead a meeting, right? Or how I do job performance. Then you have key actions, things you do within a process that allow success to occur. So that's a, very broad summary there. Tim, turn it over to you to see if you'd like to add some commentary.
No, I think you're right. I think the analogy or the metaphor of height, and if you look at how rarefied oxygen is and how difficult it is to maintain your normal breathing the higher up you go, it gives you a sense in which just using those pictures allow you to understand the difference between somebody whose kind of summit is 12,000 feet and another person whose summit is 29,000 feet. And guess what? The organization would want to employ somebody whose summit is higher. In terms of metaphor, Jabra and I were just exchanging, and I remember I was very lucky when I became medical director. I think in 2010, I had the opportunity to go and see Sir Nicholson at the time. He was the chief executive of the NHS. And as a psychiatrist, I knew that he'd always been interested in the idea of how do psychiatrists or mental health prove their value? Well, we can't cost up lots of what we do. We're seen as a Cinderella specialty, at least in the UK. I don't think we are, but that's how we're seen. And I was thinking, what can I use to show him that we understood what we were about? And it just came to me in terms of a metaphor about the distinction between height and beauty. And I said, look, physical medicine is like height. If you believe in the ordinal scale, it doesn't matter whether you agree or not, we can get a measure and we can decide with some degree of objectivity who to learn the other person. So in terms of physical medicine, there are ways in which you can calculate how much it costs in a kind of orderly manner. What about beauty? Beauty is dependent on who's looking, what they're looking at, what time in history they're looking at it. But actually, when you see something beautiful, it's based on some shared understanding of what beauty might be for that particular era. And I said, look, mental health like beauty, the value we add is more like beauty than in heights. And therefore, in trying to judge how much money you're going to give us or how we compare ourselves to other specialties, it'll be unfair to use just height. You need to use context and the subjectivity of evaluating beauty. And for the 45 minutes I had with him, he understood that. And that was an interesting point that I took away. And that was just the way in which I tried to bring a complex interpretation of not just costs and value and parameters, but make it something that were universally applicable. We all know about height and we all know about beauty. And we all know that we want to be the tallest we can be within limits. We all want to be the most handsome or most beautiful or whatever adjective or description you want to use. So that's just an example of how, in that particular context, I use the metaphor. It wasn't an interview, but it was an interview in a way because I had to show my best self. Otherwise, he'd be saying, why would my boss at the time send me there to waste his time? So, Brian, over to you.
Yeah, that's great. And we're not going to learn everything about this framework today. We're just giving nuggets and examples. But just to emphasize what Tim said, metaphors are a great way to bridge experiences, right? And so that's what Tim's talking about, saying this is beauty. And you want to use both stories and metaphors. They're different. For example, I could tell you the story of Romeo and Juliet as a metaphor at star-crossed lovers. They answer different questions. You want both of them. They have different functions. So, that's good. Another tips, and Tim brought it up again, the mountain. You want to be able to deepen your metaphors. So we had a partner that wrote a book on teams, and in working with me, developed some metaphors around teams as engines. And I said, if you're serious about this, do some reading about engines. And the more important in defining this metaphor is, the more you have to know about it. So you want to be able to deepen your metaphors, not be superficial. Give me more interesting. So, for example, related to elevation, you think of Everest. What does Everest have? The death zone. That's because it doesn't always work out. And that's what it's like when you're interviewing at the highest levels. You're interviewing against the best of the best. And even though you are great, you can lose and you can fail. And it's cruel, but that's the way it is. And, anyone can climb Fuji, but you're going after Everest, and that's, again, deepening the metaphor with the depth zone. So let's move on here. So many of you did the Explore Interview AQ test. If you have not done it, you can take it. And it allows you to look at simple questions, why should I hire you, and answer types. And the way it's presented is sort of context neutral, and it may seem a little odd, but there is a logic, and you get a report, and there's a mapping. One way I like to describe this, to illustrate, is imagine you're going to Boots, the convenience store, and you ask the clerk, how do I find a candy bar? Or how do I find a Mars candy bar? In AQ terms, the correct answer is probably a procedure. You want the clerk to say, go down aisle 1, take a left, bottom shelf. You do not want the clerk to tell you a story about the history of Mars candy bar. So there's a question and answer mapping that is intuitive, and we can listen to and can provide the right answers. How does this translate in an interview? If someone is asking you how you do things and you provide a story and you go on and on about the story, that could frustrate someone because they want a procedural answer or action answer. This is the basics of AQ, understanding question and answer mapping that relate to the circle and the organization of the questions around it. I'm going to move on, Tim, unless you want to interject.
No, please move on.
So just briefly, where did AQ come from? It's based on my academic research, and we studied the top golf instructors in the world and how they provide answers. And you may say, golf instructors, why? And basically, we studied golf instructors for 2 reasons. They were experts. It's always good to study experts in the upper half of the 99th percentile of their profession. There's 25,000 golf instructors, in the US alone. We were studying those, and the top 100, top 50 is ranked by Golf Digest and Golf Magazine. Second is these golf instructors taught a wide range of students. So these top instructors would teach touring pros you see on TV, to business professionals, to your young son or daughter, picking up the sticks for the first time. And in research speak, there was no restriction of range. And that was particularly important because this relates to all kind of professions, and there's gonna be all kind of asymmetries of knowledge, like you have, going from medical to non-medical setting, asymmetries of interest, understanding, et cetera, and so forth. And our work applied to the golf instructors, and it also is something to generalize outside of golf. And we found that to be the case in the book, and now working with partners in 16 countries around the world. So that's the research in a nutshell. Here we're going to talk, getting to the main event here, about influence, achieving the summit, landing that job interview, having multiple offers, highest amount of money, best terms. This is what you want, right? So before we, get into an exercise on interviewing, I'm going to give you a touchstone example about AQ. When I was first experimenting with AQ, before the book was written and I did the research, I was starting to experiment with using different answers in the world. And here's the setup. I was a consultant. I had an opportunity working with the CEO, and it was a client of mine. And I wanted to bring in a third party. So the 3 of us, right? A little triangle. And the third party was a technology platform. So in AQ terms, the question I wanted to convey and answer for the CEO is, what is a partnership? Very basic. And I Googled on the internet and found a metaphor that I liked around a three-legged stool. And I told the executive, this partnership is like a three-legged stool. All three of us have to work together. If you pull one of the legs out, the stool is going to fall down. I was trying to convey that's what the partnership was. I bit my tongue after I said it. I didn't know if it landed. And sure enough, it did. 1 week later, I returned to meet with the CEO, and unprompted, he, reiterated that metaphor back to me. I knew it worked. He internalized it. And that's when I first started to believe in AQ and its potential. And basically, my discussion with this CEO centered around basic questions. What is a partnership? Why is the partnership important? And how is the partnership going to be implemented? And another sort of digging a little deeper, as a management professor, I would teach classes, and I would always be sort of stumped because some students, they have metaphors that landed and others that didn't, and it seems sort of arbitrary. And I was reflecting on the metaphor I gave the CEO, and the reason it worked is because all my other answers were strong. And basically, I conveyed a story of, and stories of how the partnership would work, theory, cause and effect logic related to the CEO's business model. I defined what a partnership was. For example, partnership to me is, beyond financial considerations, giving up time, talent, and energy, and all these, all parties are going to do this. I explained procedures, the steps by which the partnership may unfold, and key actions that will enable the partnership. So that's the reason that the metaphor worked. And why am I bringing this up for you is because you're going to be in an interview and you might feel a little bit clumsy about using a metaphor during an interview. But if all of your other answers support it, a seemingly obvious and simple metaphor like a stool will be profound and very well received. This is really my first instance when I was experimenting with AQ and found that it had utility for me. So, I want to move on to interviews, but, Tim, before I do, I don't know if you have any other sort of setup points for the audience, or we can move on to the interviews.
No, I think it's right. I don't have too much right because you've been very kind of eloquent and clear. The thing I think also about when I've used the model is the crafting of each answer type. And I think that's something we'll probably come on to later on, I hope, Brian, is the notion that the story is not just my story in the context of an interview. My story has to hook on to something in their story. So it's not just coming up, I can come up with lots of interesting about me as an interviewee, but if it doesn't hit something that they're interested in listening to, then so there's also some design principles in how you choose to structure each individual answer type. I just thought I'd share that, and I don't know what you make of that, Brian.
Yeah, that's well said. That in reiterating a point you made before, AQ is simple but not simplistic. So now imagine you have two interviews, and then I'll deviate slightly from your. Let's stick with story. So in the first interview, I talked to Bob, and Bob tells me a legendary story in the company, right? And I note it. And then I go on the second interview. Bob's in the meeting, and I slip in a story that's my own story that's consistent with Bob's story. So basically, I'm answering why you should hire me with my story, but it's consistent with Bob's story, which is in the context, when and where. So this is like going from checkers to chess, and it's sort of very logical, but these are the subtleties you need to think about. And, that can be extremely powerful. So that's an example there. Let's move on, if that's okay, Tim, and talk about interview AQ. And I think we've firmly established that, as you're climbing the mountains, the elevation increases, your skills need to be better. You're climbing that rock wall. And you're climbing the wall like this. So we're gonna go through a little exercise. We're gonna look at interview AQ, and we're gonna have a couple questions that I'm gonna frame, and Tim's gonna provide some sample answers, and then we're gonna followed by breakouts, and we're gonna do that for each of the primary questions. So if this still makes sense, Tim, what we're gonna do is the what question. So if you're asked explicitly what's your transferable skill, or it could be implicit, right? They may not vocalize it, but they're basically trying to understand why this medical doctor should work in this non-medical setting, what is your number one skill that's transferable? So you need to be able to provide that as a concept and metaphor answer. So Tim, let me, ask you to see if you could maybe provide some examples of both of these, and then we're going to do some breakouts where you can work with a colleague, think through this yourself, and then, we'll discuss and move on to the why question, then the how question. But Tim, is this something you could answer for us, or at least give some perspective on?
Yes, I think.
I was just going to add, unfortunately, we can't do breakout rooms on this setting as it's a webinar, so we'll be working on our own.
All right, we could change things up, of course.
And the chat function is still not working, even though I have tried to fix it. So yeah.
I think I'm putting myself as if I was applying for a job outside medicine. And so if I was asking Brian's question, I'd say, what's your most transferable skill? I would say it's the crafting of sticky messages as a metaphor. And a sticky message, a message you can't get away from, the message that compels itself and reminds you of itself all the time. Why is it important? It might be that I'm applying for a job in HealthTech, and HealthTech that is availing itself of a service for patient utilization. And they need to craft something that translates from tech language, coding, to something tangible for a patient or for a client base or for a service user. So if I say I can give them sticky messages, it means I'm thinking about the message that a patient that I have worked with as a psychiatrist might grab onto and decide to use their products rather than other people's products. So for instance, it might be something in M Health, an app. And I think, well, how the app configures itself, what it tells you about your ability to manage anxiety might be where I come in. And I could give them examples of, so I'm thinking that what a sticky message might mean using a story or theory, because there's some evidence that sticky message has been used in different contexts before. And I think that might be a metaphor I would throw forward, something sticky. Now, sticky can always not be always positive, but I will spin it in a positive way, saying something you want to latch onto, something you don't let go of because it sticks to you and makes you feel better.
That makes a lot of sense. And just sort of, talking about what you just said, that stickiness makes sense. And, going back to the medical setting, as a physician, there's asymmetries of knowledge, right? You're talking about some new drug, some reason to use it. And, you could prescribe something, but, how to use the drug, but someone may not understand why they want to use it or how they want to, what it is. You're saying you could translate that in a medical setting, and you can apply those same skills, this same context around a medical application to the business app. So that's a good example. And I also say I like the metaphors, the stickiness, but then you could also think through other metaphors, and maybe some other metaphor may be better for different individuals. Like, for example, another thing that comes to mind is like a magnet and iron filings or something. It's a force that compels someone to do something, which, is a variation of stickiness, but a magnet has rules with iron filings must come. Imagine if you had that same level of potency working with clients that, you want to compel them to take the medicine and to do everything. And, that's sort of stickiness with the app. I'm not trying to say that's a good metaphor, but one of the things you can do is, use ChatGPT, take your number one soft skill, put that in and say metaphors, and give me a list of 10 metaphors, and boom, you'll have some metaphors. Start playing around with the metaphors that you think are best for you. And, it takes some time to craft it. For example, give you a real example. Imagine if you're doing an interview, and I'll take this outside of the transferable skills, but maybe just something fundamental for the interview. And it's clear that in your new role, you're going to be managing a team of 5 supervisors, okay? And they have very little experience. So maybe a really great metaphor to suggest during that interview is, what makes you qualified to work with these people? You can say, I understand that these are junior people. They're going to need some experienced person to guide them. And I'll tell you what, I've worked with a lot of emerging leaders, and leadership is like gardening. You can water and fertilize the plants, but they don't always grow. And that's the kind of support I'm going to provide these emerging leaders. I'm going to explain to them that your job can be frustrating at times and you may be trying hard to make progress, but it's not always going to happen. And I'm going to convey those metaphors to help them grow as professionals. So that would be an example of a metaphor really on point if you're working with, very junior people. Obviously, the appropriate metaphors are going to depend on the context and flow of the interview, but thinking of before the interview starts, take your number one soft skill, develop 6 answers, be ready with your identity as you go into the interview. Let me pause there, Tim, and see if you have any reaction to what I just said there.
No, I think what I did on purpose was to almost do what you'd explained, that people have to then refine the initial. So the concept of sticking in, I'm very happy you use magnet, because actually magnet is the more immediate. But sticky is the principle that what a magnet, anything that's likely to be attracted to a magnet, if you put a magnet in the vicinity of it, it sticks to it. So magnet is a bit more, there's a further iteration of the concept of stickiness. And that just shows you that you start with one premise and you hone it until you get something that's compelling. I think I'm very happy that Brian showed how you can move from kind of elementary metaphor or principle and then move it into a metaphor that has a kind of higher level acuity and can hit the mark a bit clearer.
Yeah, and then you have the back and forth conversation, you refine your metaphor, you double down on it, etc. Like at the risk of being self-indulgent, but also explaining to everyone here listening, what is AQ? And I often say AQ is like a container. You can put any liquid in it. And sort of Tim alluded to, it could be used for interviews, for leadership, etc. And I often like to say when I'm like working with a prospect or partner, I'll say, when you go to the coffee shop, the most important thing is the coffee, and my mug supports you. And it was interesting. In a recent call I had, one of the partners said, "Are you basically saying your mug doesn't add any value? It doesn't matter?" So then we had a conversation. I said, "Okay, maybe I'm like the Yeti mugs, those expensive ones that do better insulation." So he was sort of forcing me to push me, with what my metaphor was, and I had to be dynamic in the conversation. So that gives you a good idea of how conversations unfold, and you will get to a point in the conversation when something lands. It could be a metaphor, story, procedure, action. It lands, and you sort of double down on that, use that as an anchor for other aspects of the conversation. And that's really, a powerful technique. Should we move on? I don't know if I guess the chat doesn't work. So we can move on to the next, question type. Before we do, though, I wonder, Tim, if there's any questions you have of me, sort of in this context about the what question and sort of how medical doctors might respond. So, give you a chance to, if there's anything you want to ask me, otherwise we can move on to the why question.
No, I think probably, I think that's sufficient for now. I guess maybe when we get to questions, we can further explore it. So I want to get the benefit of sampling as many answer types as they can get us to sample.
Yeah, and I should say, here's a little advanced tip. Before I move on, there's the why, what, and how questions. Simon Sinek's to start with why. I think it's usually better to start with what. And sort of the metaphor, this is like exercise. What's the adage in exercise? You focus on your core, right? And then you can, your upper body and lower body, and the metaphor breaks down here at some point, but the focus on the core is important. You can move up to why questions, down to how questions. My metaphor breaks down, but the point is, particularly when there's asymmetries of knowledge, when people have different understanding of basic things, if someone says, to why do you want to be a leader here at this organization, I would pivot down to say, before I answer that question, let me define for you what I think leadership is. For example, or what leadership is. To me, I, define leadership as helping others to achieve goals. And I primarily do that by inspiring and holding people accountable. That's a concept answer. Then I could say as a metaphor, leadership is 2 ropes. When the ropes are separate, they're strong. When they're braided together, they're stronger. Each meeting, I try to inspire and hold people accountable. And then does that make sense to you? And they'll probably be real excited by that kind of thoughtfulness and answer. And then you can say, well, now let me tell you why I want to be a leader here. And then you weave in a story about inspiration and or accountability. obviously, I'm sort of connecting these dots in a very, arguably cogent, concise way, but you too are going to be able to do similar things, in real time during conversation. So this is an example of going down to what, getting confirmation, then moving up to why. So that's a technique I would encourage you to do, because the risk is you tell a why leadership is important to your story, and you two, both of you on either sides of the table, have very different views of what leadership is. So there's a potential risk in your answer not landing because of those differences of opinions. So let's go up to the why. Why is your skill important? Going back to my example, my setup here with the chief safety officer going from his industry to a new industry, why is resilience important? Why is stickiness important? So you have to be able to answer this with a story and theory, and theory is the cause and effect logic. So Tim, I'll turn it over to you either to provide some answers and or commentary on this.
Yeah, I think the skill that I might be setting to management consultancy or health tech or any other startup is about an understanding of systems. System thinking, system leadership is got lots of literature. And it's because people now understand that the old ways of working, which you work in hierarchies, don't work anymore. And that the predictability of human organizations and interactions between them are things you really have to be more prudent about now, because you talk about heterarchies where you have small groups of people working in discrete bundles, and the impact of what they do emerges over time. You can't predict anything. So if you're looking to sell your wares to a company that has to take account of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, your knowledge as a doctor, where symptoms are coming, where you're having to make sense of stuff, having to connect things and come to a holistic understanding of the human being as a homeostatic system, is something they can say, so, this person used to thinking around systems, used to thinking about when things don't quite fit. And therefore, if we employ this person, he or she or they will bring that skill of understanding systems in a way that is based on a theoretical knowledge base, a literature base in business, saying actually systems thinkers who connect things, who understand that when you make those connections, you need to anticipate, and by so doing, build resilience in the organization. They'll say, this person brings in an understanding of systems. This person brings in a discipline that medicine has conferred upon him or her. And therefore, in the way they've narrated it, they've shown us why that theory of thinking systems is compelling. Us saying that's the person we want, because they've understood that we work in a system where there's a quick turnover of, say, knowledge. There's a customer base that is kind of fractious and willing to change that quick. So understanding how to connect those things, understanding quantums of risk are important things you're looking for in, say, a mid-level, a new signing, or even a high-level strategic advisor to our business. So I'll stop there and see what Brian can make of what I've thrown out there.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And you think of, the value you're bringing to the organization, a lot of it might be related to systems and in theory, and obviously in AQ terms. And that's something important to convey. Give you another example of sort of theory, because theory can seem like common sense, but it's not. For example, I was working with a bank in Canada, and there were a lot of stories in the organization that employee engagement was really important to job performance, right? And this bank used business analytics, and they found out that employee engagement had zero relationship to any business outcomes they cared about, performance, satisfaction, etc. And that's sort of interesting. I think with AQ, thinking in AQ terms, it's, stories and theories are different answers. They can triangulate. Sometimes they can be divergent. But if, to sort of extend this idea of consulting is, yes, you want to listen to stories of others, but also you want to think of the theory, the cause and effect logic. And, there may be times when you're going to suggest a different cause and effect logic than is, prevailing story, for example. In an AQ terms, you want to provide all these answers and, triangulate all of them. But the point is, you want to convey theoretical relationships, that you think are important. Like, for example, take mentoring, which I brought up before. And, Why is mentoring important? You want to think this through and be able to say mentoring is important for retention. Mentoring is important for job performance, et cetera, and so forth. You want to make explicit this logic so you can articulate it to others. It shows command and gravitas. So those are just a couple additional points that I think complement your perspective points, Tim. Is there anything else you'd like to comment on here with the why question, or should we move on to the how?
And I think just to reiterate and get your thoughts on that notion of the connectiveness of the story. And I think what I advise my coaching clients to do, and when they're doing kind of career kind of pivot, is how well do they understand the segment they're looking to work in? How well have they understood the organizations they're applying to work within? How well have they understood the human leadership, the cultural signatures or the brand signatures of, and how do they have something of the story that connects with what that organization is looking to achieve? And I think quite a number of people now, there's been a burgeoning in the market in the UK, I don't know about US, around electronic patient records, about the fact that patients or service users get tired of constantly having to repeat themselves, and that medical folk and other clinicians are fed up of having to enter data into multiple repositories, and that there's lots of risk inherent in bits of information being, so a story that hooks onto a patient outcome that is improved by using a particular approach might be something that sells you to people who want to employ you to support delivery of their patient information system. A story that shows what could have been different if they deployed a proper proprietary product within that EPR space will also be, because it's not just about trying to get them to bring up their violins, so to say. It's about saying, I know what you're in the business of trying to change. I know where your value proposition is. And this story speaks to what I can bring to connect up to your story of increasing the value of what you want to provide in the space you're in the market of. So I just thought I'd share that as a kind of further elucidation of what Brian was saying earlier on.
Yeah, and I want to amplify what you're saying. And this gets it into some of the high EQ practices and that are sort of techniques to combine answers sort of beyond the scope of our discussion proper today. But one of them is alluding to answer transformations. So in that conversation, if it's about procedures with medical records, you can go to town on talking about procedures, but I think what Tim is saying, there may be instances when you want to transform that into a story. Not only that, those that have strong command can take any answer and transform it to any of the other answers, right? So, if you're talking about the procedure for medical records, what's the key concept, there? Is it reliability? What is the theory? Reliability leads to some kind of outcome. What is the story? What is a metaphor for reliability? What is a key action related to reliability? That's sort of a hallmark of those that have expertise and command, is they can transform one answer to any other answer type. And to sort of punctuate this a little bit more, I'm reminded of, what's something that popped in my head is, legendary professors throughout the years, take Einstein, for example, and others, they would often want to teach at the entry level. And that may seem sort of odd. But I think in AQ terms, they found it interesting because they were forced to transform their theories into other answer types, simple stories anyone could connect to, simple procedures, simple actions. So sort of a test for your ability as you go on the job market is, with the asymmetries of knowledge, can you transform any one answer into other answer types in ways that others can understand? So I think what Tim is saying makes a lot of sense. Go from procedures, transform into stories. Let me stop there, Tim.
Yep.
Should we move on to the how question?
Yep. Yeah.
Okay. So, how do you provide your skill? In terms of procedures or actions, you need to convey this, and whatever the context is. If you're gonna be leading a team, let me tell you, if it's about resilience is your concept, let me tell you a procedure of how I increase resilience during meetings. Let me tell you a key action. And let me say one other thing before I turn over to Tim. When you think of procedures are steps. So you think of like a recipe. The 10 steps in a recipe refer to the procedural steps. The action are any, given things that are performed during the recipe, like cracking an egg. So basically, procedures organize actions and there's sort of logic, but actions are things that we perform within the procedure. So to illustrate this, think of actions. They can either be what I would call unique or best practice. So if you, one of the examples I like to give is like, this is an iPhone, right? When Steve Jobs did his original product launch with the iPhone, he did something sort of interesting. He went to the phone and he touched the screen. And everyone in the audience went wild, crazy, because this was a unique action. It was the first time people had touched the screen. And now fast forward to today, that's a best practice, touch screen phone. You couldn't have one that wasn't that. Now, how does this relate to interviews? When you're providing actions, you need to provide unique actions that differentiate you in the marketplace the way Steve Jobs did and differentiate you from other candidates. But you also have to provide best practices actions. In this case, it might be showing that you have gravitas around, business management principles or wherever you're trying to move into, that you can do sort of, exemplary actions. So that's a long way of saying you need to provide procedures and actions to answer the how questions. Let me turn it over to Tim to see kind of commentary you'd like to provide as this relates to our.
I think some of the procedures that are commonplace in medical practice, like safety huddles, S-bar evaluations, are things that you can transfer in the interview context. Because what you're showing is an understanding of the fact that standardization of certain processes or procedures, action steps is a good thing in a multiplicity of instances. Obviously, you need to have a bit of organicity, creativity, innovation, but you go into an industry that requires precision, then being able to transcribe the fact that as a doctor, or whatever discipline or specialty, there are certain aspects of, first of all, sense making, understanding what's going on, being able to express it clearly, having a process for translating what you found into something that other people within the organization can also understand and work with, is a procedure. And as Brian said, each procedure has a series of actions, and it's about being able then to show them that things like ward reviews have specific actions that are set out in a particular way. So the discipline of having an orderliness and thus a predictability is something that has become second nature to you as a doctor. So if people are looking for somebody who not only can do the creativity, which you might have done in the kind of areas of the why and the what, but the how is also important. So they say, actually, this person not only, as using Brian's metaphor, the core is strong, they go up into kind of rarefied strategic realm, but also the roots, the tap roots, the rootedness, the anchoring, I'm using metaphors now, of everyday procedures and actions that are predictable and precise, will say, we got the total value chain in this person, and therefore we want to give this person another job. And I think it's really thinking about where are the areas, because also what they're probably looking for is an articulation, an exposition of a codified way of narrating what you do. So you've done these things, and the mistake you can't make is not to be able to transcribe what we might see as commonplace in everyday medical practice into something that is compelling to those who don't have that system. And we're flooded with bits of paper, accountability, looking at when adverse outcomes come. Those are things that I think, if you refine and repackage, will stand you in good stead if you're looking at companies where they're looking to manage money in the early phases, or they're not quite sure about how their systems work. They're looking to evaluate some aspects of leaning down processes such that they're not wasting resources, and that those actions are things you can put into a system using defined kind of models from medicine, will be things that can sell you more strongly and more impactfully than you otherwise would have if you don't use a model like AQ to help you structure your thinking. So that's what I'd say in response to procedure and action.
Let me add on to that. I think very well said. And actions can be unique or best practice, and that can also apply to other answer types like procedures. And I think, just to punctuate your point, a procedure that's best practice within the medical physician community could be very unique in a different setting. and maybe it's connecting to risk management, and they're all excited because they never thought about doing, these kind of procedures, and you can bring all of this to their world. Another practical tip in terms of procedures, concepts, and story, this doesn't necessarily escalate to all the answer types, is think of rules of three. If somebody, when you provide a procedure, provide 3 steps. Don't provide 20 steps. No one, needs that level of detail usually. 3 steps. If they want more, then you can follow up and you can extend it. Rule of 3 with procedures. Rule of 3 with stories. What's a story have? Beginning, middle, and end. That may seem obvious, but so many people tell stories and there's no end. It's just sort of a beginning, middle, and there's no punchline, or there's no distinctions. Concepts. So you noticed before when I said mentoring, I said, what is mentoring? Career support, social support, and role modeling. Rules of 3. Breaking something down shows command. You can have more than 3, but the point is 3 is a good rule of thumb, particularly for concepts, dimensions, procedures, 3 steps, stories. So these are some things you can use to operationalize AQ. It disciplines you, because you might be all excited about your procedure and you're going into all these details. Be disciplined. 3 steps. Stop. Ask them if that answer sufficed. So that's just a couple of points I wanted to add to your comments there, Tim. Great.
Yeah, I'm wondering whether, I don't know, there's also more slides, whether some people might have gotten a flavor of what we're trying to impart. And then clearly, although they can't do breakouts, they can do breakouts of 1. And those who are brave enough can come in and throw something in the mix as to what the most potent take-home message or kind of insight they have gleaned from either having taken the pre-masterclass self-assessment, or indeed what they've heard us talk about in the last 50 or so minutes. I don't know but so I think there might be some more slides, but I wonder if that might be a good thing to get them to actually use some of what they've heard in the kind of initial iteration.
Yeah, that sounds good. And just to clarify, are we able to receive any questions at all, or do we have no ability for questions? Because it would be great to have some questions from the audience.
If anyone has any questions, they can put that in the Q&A box.
Okay.
That's still working, but the chat box unfortunately is not working at this moment.
Okay. So I don't know. I don't see any questions in the Q&A box. I mean, we could pause for a second and maybe take a minute and see if you have some questions, and then we could answer those.
So just to clarify with this exercise, so what is the best way to approach it at the moment?
So I think normally when we do a breakout here, we would have had 3 different breakout sessions. First of all, just to recap, the broad context, you're going to be interviewing and you need to transfer your skills. So asking and answering 3 basic questions. What is your most transferable skill in terms of a concept and metaphor? So thinking about that, do you have an answer for that, an initial answer? Does that feel comfortable? Do you have any questions about, what is a metaphor, or, things like that? And then going through a similar exercise for why is that number 1 skill important in terms of theory or story? Maybe you self-reflect. Can you think of a story where that skill is important? And maybe later on you can refine that story for something you can tell. And yeah.
I was going to say, so for example, Louise has asked a question. Can you give an example of how to answer some common questions that would come up in an interview, for example? Could we do that? I think that would be quite useful. For example, if someone asks, why do you want to work for this company question? How would you go about kind of structuring that?
Yeah. So again, conservative approach, and it depends on the context of when this comes up in the interview. This is like the first question I get. I might have some context I can answer that, but I would go back to the what. I would say, the trying to explain what this company is about. You could say, well, I know this company is known for innovation. Innovation is very important to me. You could define innovation if you want, or then use that as a bridge to go right to the story and talk about, how you've created innovation in your medical career. So you're sort of cultivating a story that's consistent with the theory. It's about being purposeful and intentional. So something like that is a technique I would use. It's just, it's question and answer recognition. And one thing I'll say, just to point this out, is that early on in our beginning of our call, you talked about your young daughter or son that they ask the why question all the time, right? Why?
Hmm.
And that's because there's a difference between natural language and technical language. The interviewer may use the words explicitly, why, what, or how, but you have to map it to the type of question they're asking. Is it a why, what, or how question? Questions can be explicit, they could be implicit, they could be latent, and you have to address the questions being asked. So with the case about, the question you just had, why should I hire you, or whatever the question was, I would start with a what and then maybe pivot back to the why. But let me pause there. I have a feeling Tim might be more cogent on his response. I was rambling.
No, I think as usual, Brian, you're cogent. What I would do is that's the kind of deductive question. Well, what I would probably advise is they are looking for a particular type of colleague. They've set out the parameters of what they're looking for. You understand what they're about in terms of, you understand what your interest in them is. Out of that should come a compelling narrative as to why you want to work for them. And if it's a surprise, if what you come up with is not something that tickles them in some ways and says, this person gets us, and this person is bringing something additional to our benefit, this person actually making a sacrifice, a chosen to leave something they've been persuaded was their vocation for a while, and then pivoting to come and support us, that's where the link is. You need to show them that you're the one who they've been looking for. And the only way you can show them that is there's something called a design approach, where you're saying, how do I understand their pinch points? What's the gap that this role is going to fill? What do I bring to it? And how do I bring all the tools I have, my experience, my expertise, my passion, my commitment, framing it using a model like AQ to then provide that compelling story. So it's about, this is not just about giving you microwavable answers, but about helping you structure the way you present yourself as a discipline. And then out of that comes iterations and refinements of responses. So there isn't a generic answer, because it depends on who are you applying to. But nobody wants to employ somebody who makes them bored, who doesn't understand what they're about, who has no passion, who can't even articulate what they've done for a career that they spend a long time doing. So those are the no-nos. But the yes-yeses are saying, this is a tech company. They're looking for creativity. At the same time, there's some discipline in the way tech companies work. There's coding, there's issues about a customer relationship, there's stakeholders. How do I bring all the things I've done, all the politicking I've had to do as I've gone up the food chain in medicine, all the challenges I've had to do in terms of exams, focus, commitment, how do I articulate them using any of these answer types to compel them to say, I'm the one for them? So that's a kind of a more discursive response, because there isn't, giving you a pat response would be wrong, because it doesn't take into account context. And actually, this is about really leveraging your understanding of context and sharpening your responses. That's what I think answer intelligence does.
And how do doctors go about practicing this outside of the interview room, so to speak?
Because I think, remember that, and I'll hand over to Brian, remember that it's not really a novel idea. For those people who did medicine in the UK, I did the medicine in West Africa, same principle. You do your letters, your supporting letters when you're applying to medical school. Oh, I play violin grade 8, I play hockey, they're trying to give a rounded, so as a doctor, you're not just a factotum in a kind of production line medicine. You come with your own unique heritage, your gender, your interests, your passions, your additional skills that are not medicine. And it's about thinking around, who am I? So I think, I don't know, Brian, thing, and I'll stop here, is if you can say there's a kind of meta answer. Now, what I mean meta answer is the story of who I am. So I'll give you an example. A British-born African heritage male whose origins are in Southwest Nigeria, who was born in this country and went to medical school in a different country and then came back and spent most of his life in the southeast of England. That's my story, but it might not be of interest to anybody, unless, of course, they're looking for somebody who might understand a potential market in West Africa or potential market somewhere in the world where I have some experience from. That's one example. What's the theory? What are the theories that have influenced me? As a psychiatrist, I'm more interested in the sociocultural aspects. I'm a kind of anthropology and the humanities inform I'm not necessarily somebody who's, I use medication because I have to. And therefore, if I go to pharma interview, I'm going to be found out very quickly because I'm not that interested in pharma. What's the concept I'm interested in? I'm interested in communicative effectiveness, managing complexity, systems. Procedures, I'm not one that's very good for procedures. So I have to really remind myself, but I'm focused on using things like Eisenhower's matrix and delegation. Actions, I like to, I'm not necessarily wedded to MBTI, but I've got extroversion and I'm not necessarily the one for detail and stuff. Metaphors, some are good, some are bad. And that's just me at a meta level. And then when I'm going for an interview, I'm now saying, okay, what's the story of the company I'm going to, how can, if their product was to be given a metaphor, what is it they actually do? What actions are they expecting from their future employees? What procedures in terms of policies and practices? What's the concept that is their USP? What theoretical framework are they? So you see how you can begin to build this composite that starts from you as an individual and then moves into specific areas you want to go into. So that's what I'll be responding to your question. I don't know what Brian thinks.
Well, I want to sort of respond. It's sort of a right angle. You sort of, maybe it's related to what you're saying, but it sort of inspired me to think about a point that I wanted to bring to the audience. And there's a question in the question box area I think I want to address after that. But there's two ways to think about responding, questions and answers. One, you want to respond to the questions the other party is asking and provide your most compelling answer. And I think that's great. Another way of looking at this that I think is empowering is that, you're answering your own questions and you're bringing to the job your own capabilities, and you want to manifest and bring these out in a way. And you only want to work someplace where you can be your full self. So what I mean by that is in the book, there's a chapter on interview AQ. And I coached a undergraduate student to get a job at a Big Four accounting firm. And she got the job. Not only that, they said she was one of the best candidates they've ever had in terms of a communicator. She was using AQ. And the truth was she was a great candidate, but she was using these techniques. But one of the things she told me she made sure to do is every interview, she wanted to convey the 6 answer types around her number one soft skill. And basically what she went on to say was she only wanted to work someplace where they understood who her full self was and what she was bringing to the table. So that's another way to look at these interviews. And, that becomes particularly apparent when you do multiple job interviews, you have multiple offers. What do you choose? The one where your answers come to the forefront. So that's another way I think that could really empower you is they're interviewing you, but you're interviewing them and you want to convey who you are and will they take you on as a candidacy. So, I'm not sure if my point, is directly connecting to what you said, Tim, but something you said inspired me to want to convey that to everyone, that's listening.
I think that's a really good point that you've raised. I do think a lot of doctors forget that it is two-way.
Yeah.
That, as a doctor, you're interviewing them as much as they're interviewing you. So it's also important to do your own homework and due diligence on the company so you can answer those questions confidently or actually decide whether it's worth you showing up in the first place.
Yeah. Be confident. And you could say, you know what? I've done innovation in medicine. I want to do that in a, consumer packaged good industry. And you go in there and say, I want to do innovation. If you're not about innovation, you're not going to let me do it, then okay, we're going to part ways and we're not going to, be working together. And by the way, that's the difference between like junior level positions and oftentimes senior level positions, within an industry or across industries. If you're a CEO or a top person, you only move if the positions are right. You're more discerning. You should be more discerning as you're going from your, medical profession, you're a senior person to other positions. You're taking just the right positions, particularly in this job market, right? It's a tight job market. They're looking for people like you. You interview well, you'll be able to go anywhere you want. I wonder if we can go to the chat box. I want to answer a question there.
Yeah.
It says, please, can you explain what exactly is a theory again? And can you give some more examples? So theory is cause and effect logic. For my background, it's related to psychology, sociology, and a lot of those human sort of components. So an example of a theory is basically your belief system, cause and effect. So for example, I could convey in an interview that a theory I believe is that leadership is related to turnover. And actually, there's a lot of empirical evidence. For example, you may have heard this, that employees do not leave the company, they leave the supervisor. So given this tight job market where people are, changing jobs, one, you could, rely on and understand, the empirical evidence out there. But even if you didn't have access to that empirical evidence, you could convey that as your theory. You could say, hey, I know you're having troubles with turnover here, and I believe that supervisors determine whether people stay or leave. Let me give you some stories of examples of how people stayed, et cetera, and so forth. So theory is cause and effect logic. It's explicating that. So, it could be, almost anything, I'm going to be innovative because that leads to, future valuation of your firm as a tech startup, right? They know that to be true, right? The more innovative you are, the higher your valuation is going to be. So at a basic level, theory is nothing more than cause and effect logic. But so many people don't think about these basics. Like doubling down on my example of employee engagement. How many companies are just doing employee engagement? They don't really know, the type of outcomes to expect. So you have to be explicit with your logic, communicate it in a way that's compelling and support it with other answer types. So that's how I would sort of address that question, what is theory, and some examples. So hopefully that illustrates a little bit more. It's basically your belief system, cause and effect, period.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, both. So like moving forward, what advice would you give to doctors who are looking to really invest in kind of practicing, structuring, raising their AQ for the purposes of nailing a non-clinical interview at this stage? Like, what would be the best next steps?
I'll give one concise response, Tim, and then turn over to you.
All right.
I think if you're going to do one thing, it's sort of taking your number one soft skill and developing 6 answers for that. In a sense, who are you? You're the answers you provide the world, right? If you're supposed to be innovative and you do not have a story of you being innovative, you don't have a metaphor related to it, you don't have a procedure or an action at the ready, how innovative are you really? You really thought it through. So take whatever is most identity central to the what you want to get the job for, innovation, mentoring, leadership, whatever it is, develop 6 answers, prepare before the interview, and you're going to have more confidence, and it'll just start flowing during the interview. You're going to start, conveying those ideas. So that would be my number one suggestion, is prepare by identifying 6 answers to be at the ready.
Yeah, following up on what Brian said, there's a whole taxonomy of supports and resources in the AQ kind of family of resources, and I'm beginning to use AQ for coaching, for interview coaching specifically, because I think in some ways when you've done the pre-work and you have a target in place, just sharing your responses or your anticipated responses with somebody else who has some understanding of AQ will take them further still. And as Brian said, this is kind of step 1 of AQ. There are 5 different steps that make it a lot kind of not complicated, but a lot more nuanced and sophisticated. And I think that's where people like myself, and who knows what might be a logical tie-in from the community of medics and connecting it to AQ. So people then have that as a resource for optimizing the ability to perform interviews. And the interesting thing, can envision a future where 2 people have used AQ. It becomes a battle of whose understanding of AQ has burnished their credentials better and has made them kind of more compelling as a future hire for an organization. So in summary, people who have tasted this and find it to their liking, there's much more that can be done in supporting you in terms of workbooks, in terms of using AQ, not just for interviews, for other things in startups or even making you a better interviewer. And then people like myself and other people who can tap into Brian's resource and networks can help you use AQ to as a coaching model. And there's a whole another set of issues there, but rest assured that if you want further information, just make contact, and I'll be happy to signpost you or help you directly accordingly.
Thank you so much. And could you take the screen share down just for now?
Yes.
And just to remind, we're going to go through a couple of comments and questions after this, but just to remind everyone who's with us, MedicFootprints launched the Doctors in Industry Incubator a few months ago, really to support doctors who want to get to industry faster. So it's a flexible program that gives doctors, helps them to create their own structure and framework into getting into industry. So if you want to find out more about that, go to medicfootprints.org/industry. That's particularly for doctors who are looking to get into health tech, consulting, pharma, entrepreneurs, and more. A lot of our sessions are one-to-one and group. We go deep dive into you and where you're going. It's really fun. You'll be warmed by a tribe of doctors who are doing the same thing. So if you're interested in finding out more, go to medicfootprints.org/industry. Just going to some of the questions or comments. We've got a comment from Freddie. He says, your answer from a minute ago resonates with me. It wasn't until I shifted the way I applied or interviewed for alternative jobs to a way where I honestly laid out my stall and told them what mattered to me that I found an alternative job that I love. Woohoo! Whereas previously I was in alternative jobs that I just did not satisfy me. That also resonates with me too. I think it's once you just turn on yourself and you're authentic and you look at it really as the director of you or the director of the situation rather than the kind of little person in the room, which we're used to as doctors when we're going to interviews, right? We're used to that. You know, you take the power back in a way. It's more of an even keel. And so you don't feel you've lost anything if the interview didn't go the way you wanted it, because at the end of the day, it's a two-way process. So that's really brilliant insights, Freddie. Thank you so much for sharing that with us.
Can I comment? Can I make add a comment? About the even keel, and you said prior, you're interviewing them. I think a metaphor to think about an interview or any conversation is that. Think about a recent dinner conversation you've had with a friend. If it was a good dinner conversation, what is it like? Both sides speak about equally. Both sides ask and answer questions about equally. Both sides care about each other. So, now doubling down in this, selling yourself. If you go to an interview and you don't have that kind of dialogue and conversation, then I don't want to work at that company, or at least with that person. I hate to say this, but I've done that with some partners. Tim and I hit it off right away, and I want to work with people I like. But there's other partners I've worked with where the conversation has been one-sided, it hasn't been interesting, and frankly, I don't have the time for that. Not to sound arrogant, but you as medical physicians, you bring a lot of value to the world. You want to have a conversation that's, as enjoyable as a dinner conversation. And if it's not, then move on to something else. That would be my recommendation.
I would say it's quite, you can pick that up even before you get into the interview room, like how they treat you in that whole process. Like the interview starts from first point of contact. And it's really important to remember that, and don't ignore the red flags. And I mean, I do wonder, Freddie, whether some of these jobs that you may have been in before, which didn't satisfy you, whether you kind of knew that was going to happen ahead of time. Maybe not. It'd be interesting to hear why. But yeah, that interview starts from first point of contact. Remember that. So the interview is just the formalized process bit of it, but it's a holistic thing, really. So don't forget that. Don't forget that. We've got another question to say, how can I get an organization to offer me the job that I crafted myself, a job that benefits, but a job that benefits the organization enormously in any event? So you're indicating that the job that you crafted yourself won't be useful for the organization. What do you say? No. But I understand what you're saying. So you're saying, how can I get an organization to create a job that works for me, basically, which is a very good question.
It is. I don't know. I mean, my view would be that why are you looking for a job? Isn't it a business offer that they might benefit from? You see my point? If it's a business you think they need, and if they really need it, they'll buy your services. And if the only reason why they'll offer you a job is they want to buy your services for cheaper than they buy it as a business. So it's the same. That's one way of looking at it. I know what Brian thinks, but that's what occurred to me first. Saying, if it's that compelling and they need it, they'll be biting your arm off.
Yeah, gets at the different question types. There's explicit questions where they're asking you for something, implicit. Then there's latent questions. The questions they should be answering, but they're not asking you, and you could answer these questions. So you could provide a story or a metaphor that's so compelling, they start saying, "Oh my gosh, I never thought I needed that, but I need that. Holy cow! Tell me how it works." And all of a sudden they're talking about, how you're going to work with them. So, if it's something they don't realize is important, your answers, in a sense, have to be even more compelling, because they didn't realize this was a need to begin with. In selling, it's sort of difficult to sell to someone that has a need unless it's a realized need. So you have to, sort of create that need in them. So I think it's going to be more challenging, but you can do that with compelling answers, and that's what I would say.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that. And I completely agree. I think one of the challenges we see doctors facing in particular is seeing themselves as providing a service and putting a value to that service, whether you're an employee or whether you're going in as a business. I mean, I see it very similar, like pretty much the same thing. And as Tim said, as an employee, you're cheaper and there's a bit more ownership over you. In a certain way. And this is why on the incubator we support and train and mentor doctors from both perspectives, so they know what their options are. Because you can go into a company, especially when you can't get a job that's been advertised, you can still go in by providing services to that same company and actually probably get more benefits from being paid more, working more flexibly, doing the job that you love, being able to walk away when you want to, right? So those options are 100% available for you. And as you've described with this question, you can also craft a job that you want. You can pick and choose. So there's lots of opportunity there for you. And definitely you use the Raise Your IQ model to your advantage in any conversation that you have when it comes to new opportunities. But thank you so much, Brian and Tim, for laying down some really important guidance and framework for doctors who are moving to alternative careers and non-clinical interviews in particular. I'm sure we'll hear from you again. And just remember, they're both also on LinkedIn, and Tim is on our career coach page on our website. The recording will be available tomorrow for 24 hours for non-members and ongoing for MF Premium and our incubator fellows. As I mentioned, if you are interested in a done with you approach when it comes to moving to industry compared to do it yourself or kind of browsing, then go to medicfootprints.org/industry and apply. So we only really accept doctors who are really committed in moving forward in their career to industry this year and doing it faster than you would otherwise likely do on your own. So thank you so much for your time. We've also got Freddie just before we close. Freddie said 100%. To respond to your follow-up question, my issue previously was I was fitting myself into the constraints of other organizational roles because of my desperation to move. We see that all the time. Oh my gosh, thank you for mentioning this. Plus this with the way medicine had taught me to act. I get that too. Rather than assessing what my skills, offers, preferences really were and owning that myself. Coaching really helped. Yes, coaching is amazing. And one of the best investments you'll ever make, everybody. In going on this journey to assessing what I really wanted and to find target careers that needed those skills. I mean, that just says it all, and I'm going to end it right there. Thank you so much, Freddie.
Thank you
Good
very
night,
much.
everybody.
Thank you, Diane. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.